Hello, and welcome to our webinar. We are excited to bring you the results of a new survey of college students on peer mental health counseling. I'm Marjorie Malpede. I'm the Executive Director of the Mary Christie Institute, and we are so pleased and grateful that you're making the time to spend with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our terrific partners in this effort, the Born This Way Foundation. As you likely know, Born This Way was founded by Lady Gaga and her mother, Cynthia Germanata. The foundation supports youth mental health and works with young people to build a braver and kinder world. I'd now like to introduce the Executive Director of Born This Way, Maya Anista Smith.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, for that lovely introduction, and congratulations to the Mary Christie Institute and our research team at Born This Way Foundation. We are so proud to bring these findings to you today. As Marjorie said so eloquently, our mission every day is to build a kinder and braver world. At Born This Way Foundation, our work falls into three buckets. The first is to make kindness cool. The second is to validate emotions of young people around the world. And the third is to eliminate the stigma surrounding mental health. This research is an important step in doing all three of those. And just like all of our work at the foundation, this research is guided by the experiences of young people. We know that understanding their experiences, listening to their voices, and adapting our resources and our mission to meet their needs is at the core of both the work at the Mary Christie Institute and at Born This Way Foundation. We know from previous research studies that young people are eager to support themselves and each other when it comes to their mental health. We know where they're going for support, and these new findings further highlight the need and benefit of having a trained peer to go to in times of crisis and otherwise. Supporting youth mental health is a concerted effort. My boss, Lady Gaga, and her incredible mom, Cynthia, always say that it doesn't matter how many Twitter followers you have or how big of a world stage, we all have a role to play in eliminating the stigma surrounding mental health. We're so grateful to have worked with the Mary Christie Institute and your amazing team, Marjorie, to highlight these best practices around mental health counseling on college campuses today. And we're excited to work further with youth advocates, with partner organizations, community leaders, administrators, and youth themselves to better equip this generation with the tools and resources they need to support themselves and one another. We can't wait to hear from the folks in this meeting today about the ideas you have, because this research is only as good as it is when it comes to life on your campuses and in your communities and for and with the young people in your lives. So thank you for participating, and thank you for thinking about how this research takes shape in your own life. Now I'm thrilled to hand it over to our friend Kirk, the managing editor and correspondent for higher education at GBH News. Thank you for the wonderful piece already, Kirk, and looking forward to today's conversation. Oh, Kirk, I think you're muted still. So sorry about that.
I'm the first one to break the ice. All right. So Maya, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Sorry, I'm toggling screens here a little bit. Coming to you live from the basement of the Boston Public Library, where GBH actually has a studio, but it's great to be here and to join this conversation about peer mental health and counseling. Even before the pandemic, GBH and public media has been committed to covering mental health on college campuses. And I think the experience over the past 2 years has only reinforced that commitment. And we have some great guests lined up who could put all of this new data into the context of college life and what it means for students and administrators. But first, I want to introduce Maeve Duggan. Maeve is research director at Massing Polling Group, where she works to make sure public opinion research is accessible and understandable to the public. She started her career at Pew Research Center in DC, documenting the impact of technology on American society. Maeve, thank you so much for being here. Take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kirk, and thank you to the Mary Christie Institute and the Born This Way Foundation for partnering with us on this work. Today, I'm going to be walking you through some of the key findings, and then I will turn it over to Dana Humphrey, the Associate Director of the Mary Christie Institute, who will talk you through some of the implications. So to start us off, a little bit of background on the survey itself. These results are based on a nationwide survey of just over 2,000 undergraduate college students in the US. We conducted this survey online in mid-October, and all of the data was weighted to estimated demographics of the US population of those undergraduate college students. So first, just to set the scene a little bit, we know that mental health has been a major issue on college campuses for a number of years, and we wanted to get a read on how students are doing today. We found that a majority of college students, 67%, say that they have needed help for a mental or emotional health problem over the past 12 months. At the same time, we also found that 85% of students agree that mental health is important to overall well-being. So we see this dynamic where college students are saying that they're struggling on one level, but on another level, really emphasize and recognize the importance of mental health to their overall well-being. Before we get too far into the deck, I just wanted to take a moment to define peer counseling, how we used it in the survey. We call peer counseling the process of confiding in trained peers, meaning fellow students, not friends, for mental health support. So when we reference peer counseling throughout the rest of these findings, this is what we mean. So overall, peer counseling is relatively familiar to college students. We found that half have heard of peer counseling, 40% say that it is available at their school, and 20% have personally used peer counseling. So that's 1 in 5 college students who themselves have used peer counseling. We were also interested in the interest in peer counseling for those students who aren't already using these services for one reason or another. And we found that interest is also relatively high. Just about 2/3 or 62% are interested to use peer counseling, and that includes 17% who are very interested. And again, this is among those students who aren't already using it. One reason for this interest may well be the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we've all been living through, so have college students. And we found that nearly half of them say that the disruptions caused by COVID have made them more likely to seek out peer counseling. That includes 20% who say it has made them much more likely. And this is especially true of students from certain historically marginalized groups, such as Black students, Latinx students, transgender students, and first-generation college students. We know from some of our own other polling, along with a lot of research that's been done by other organizations, that the COVID-19 pandemic has had unequal impacts on different communities. And we're seeing how this plays out in terms of mental health and peer counseling on college campuses as well. So who's actually using peer counseling? We found, as I mentioned earlier, that 20% overall use peer counseling, and it's more common among certain groups like Black students, transgender students, and first-generation college students. So again, we're seeing these groups who have been historically marginalized having a different emphasis on peer counseling, especially the Black students and the transgender students are using peer counseling at almost double the rate of college students overall. And this is important because we know that a really important aspect of peer counseling is its ability to kind of trade on shared identities. So we asked college students specifically, how important would it be to find someone with similar identities or life experiences if you were going to use peer counseling? We found that overall, about 1/3 of students, that bottom bar, say that this would be very important to them. And it becomes even more important to some of those historically marginalized groups. For example, at the top of the chart there, you can see 59% of transgender students say that this would be very important, along with 42% of LGBTQIA students, first-gen college students, Black students, and then just over a third of Latinx students. We also wanted to take a look at, once you're using peer counseling, how helpful has it been? What are the impressions that students have of peer counseling on campus? And we found that there's some good news here. Among students who already use peer counseling, 58% call it helpful, including just about a quarter who say that it's very helpful. And then we asked students who had said that peer counseling is available on their campus, what types of impressions they have it, what types of attributes they assign to it. And continuing this theme of the importance of shared identities and backgrounds, we found that 82% of these students where peer counseling is available say that it's able to serve students of various backgrounds. Majorities also said that it was easily available, confidential, respected, free, competent, and widely used. To put peer counseling in a bit of a broader context, we know that students have often turned to each other when they've been facing challenges. And so we wanted to get an idea of where peers fit in kind of the larger scheme of who they talk to when they need help. So we asked students who they would be most likely to talk to about a serious mental health issue. And we found that over a third of students would turn either to a friend or a romantic partner first when they needed to talk through some of these issues. And this is important because it reinforces how peers can directly relate to one another's problems. At the same time, we found evidence that students are wary of becoming a burden. So we found that majorities agree with statements like, some of my problems feel too big for my friends to handle. My friends can't always relate to my problems, and sometimes I feel like a burden to my friends. So while we know that students are turning to each other for help, we're also seeing that they feel there's kind of this line that they can't cross or else they'll become too burdensome to their friends. But the good news is that among students who are already using peer counseling, 83% agree that it lets me talk to someone who can understand, but is not directly involved in my personal life. So peer counseling is really useful for students to be navigating this kind of fine line between having someone who they can relate to while not overburdening or pushing their friends over the edge. We were also very interested in peer counselors themselves, especially what motivates them to help. And we found that there's a real sense of altruism. 45% of peer counselors say that it makes me feel good to help other students. We also found that there is certainly an aspect of personal experience. 40% of peer counselors saying that the service has been helpful to me and I'm paying it forward, while another 36% say, I have experienced mental health issues myself and I know how it feels. I also want to point out one more bar on this chart. That's the 28% of students, the 28% of peer counselors who say that they serve because they want to help a specific group on campus, such as students of color or LGBTQIA students. So again, just to emphasize, a real through line of our findings with peer counseling is this ability to trade on shared backgrounds and identities and the kind of support that that can lend. Finally, we found that nearly all peer counselors are satisfied with their experience. In fact, 92%, so that's a really high number. So recall kind of at the beginning of this presentation, we discussed how there's this balance between mental health and overall well-being. So we wanted to put a little bit of a finer point on this kind of dynamic. So what we did was we calculated a well-being score. This is sometimes called a flourishing scale. And we asked students a series of 8 questions that had to do with self-regard or optimism for the future. And from those answers, we were able to calculate a score for each student, where a higher score means they have a more positive sense of well-being, and a lower score means they have a less positive sense of well-being. I'd invite you to read the report for more detail on the scale, and especially to see the exact question text of those questions. But for right now, for the purposes of this discussion, we were able to calculate these scores as a relative scale of well-being. And we found that those who use or provide peer counseling are more likely to have a positive well-being score. So for example, 67%, so that's 2/3 of students who are using peer counseling have a positive well-being score, compared with only 42% of those who do not use peer counseling. And we see a similar trend for those who provide peer counseling. 71% of peer counselors have a positive well-being score, compared to, again, 42% who do not provide peer counseling. And lastly, training is, of course, a very important component of peer counseling, and something that really distinguishes it from just talking to friends. And we wanted to ask peer counselors in particular about their experiences with training, how common it is, and especially if they feel prepared to know how to deal with a situation in which they may be concerned for a student's safety. So overall, we found that most peer counselors have received at least a little bit of training, and that includes nearly half who have received a great deal of training. So training itself is really common. What's also common is having a clear protocol in place if a peer counselor does become concerned for student safety. 84% of peer counselors say that that protocol does exist. However, this does mean that 16% of peer counselors say that there either is not a protocol in place or that they are unsure if one exists. So I will leave it there for now and turn it over to Dana Humphrey, the Associate Director of the Mary Christie Institute, and she's going to talk you through some of the implications of these findings. I will be available for the Q&A section of this event, so please do add your questions or comments to the comment box. Thank you very much, and Dana, take it away.
Thanks so much, Maeve. That was so helpful. Thank you for walking us through those findings. So I will just do a really brief overview of the implications of these data and leave it to the panel to delve more deeply into the details of how these findings, really placing these findings in context on college campuses. So generally speaking, you've seen that we really saw a very positive view of students' views and experiences with peer counseling on college campuses. Students are utilizing the service. Satisfaction with it is quite high. There's substantial interest among students who are not already using the service. And it really seems to serve as an outlet for students who are belonging to certain marginalized identities. As you can see, Maeve mentioned that peer counselors scored higher on the well-being scale, which measures things like positive relationships and a sense of purpose in your life. We also saw, as Maeve mentioned, that peer counselors serve with very healthy and positive motivations, mainly a sense of altruism, as she said, a desire to help others, wanting to help certain groups on campus, and wanting to pay it forward after being helped themselves. So while these findings are all very good news for people who are interested in pursuing these programs, they do provide some cause for caution, certain data points. As Maeve mentioned, students reported turning first to friends or romantic partners for help in the case of a serious mental health issue. That really indicates a need for universal mental health training for all on college campuses. Second, as Maeve just mentioned, while peer counseling training is common, it is not universal. And the fact that 16% of students, of peer counselors, reported that they are unaware of an emergency protocol is concerning. Training for peer counselors is critical given the fact that they could be faced with a crisis situation. Third, it is important to mention that while peer counselors are quite satisfied with their experience, a strong majority reported being satisfied with their experience offering support, we still should recognize that there is an emotional burden placed on these students. Peer counselors are still students, and offering them support for their own mental well-being is really important. And actually, training can help educate peer counselors on how to provide support without it affecting their own mental well-being. And finally, peer counseling programs may want to consider compensation for students who are generously offering their time and energy to these programs. It will also serve to attract students who otherwise would not be able to participate in an unpaid position. So that being said, the real promise of peer counseling is in the ability to reach students who would otherwise not be seeking or receiving help, whether that is because of long wait times at a counseling center, lack of diversity among counselors, a perceived stigma with reaching out to traditional therapy, or simply a preference on treatment options. This really helps reach those students who otherwise would not be reached. So I'll just conclude with the idea that students really are our greatest asset. They are diverse, they're altruistic, they are extremely motivated to help, and they are already supporting each other. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Kirk, for more detail on all of these findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dana and Maeve. That was great. Really eye-opening and so important to see the data and all that's in there. We're going to chew on this a bit. We've got a great panel of experts lined up for you all. They're going to weigh in on the survey and what it means for students, administrators, and faculty. Amy Gatto is here. She's with the National Mental Health Organization, Active Minds. Amy's work really centers around higher education and what she calls evaluation, making sure that the needs of her group students are met and making sure that these programs work towards their mental and emotional health. Hana Mangat is here. She's a senior at Columbia, where she's studying urban studies, education, and race and ethnic studies. Hana is also a mental health advocate on the campus there. Michael Gerard Mason is Dean of African American Affairs at the University of Virginia. He directs the Luther Porter Jackson Black Cultural Center there, and he's a member of the university's crisis management team. Michael is also an expert advisor to the Steve Fund, which many of you know is dedicated to the mental health and emotional well-being of students of color. And Zoe Ragouzeos, she's president of the Mary Christie Institute and executive director of counseling and wellness at New York University, where she oversees the mental health services and sexual misconduct support for more than 40,000 students. If you all have questions for our panel, or I'm calling this our Hall of Fame panel, the Cooperstown inducted announced that Poppy was going to be in the Hall of Fame this summer. I think this is our Hall of Fame panel. Please do not hesitate to ask them questions in the chat. You can put them there, and our team will pass them along to me. And we've set aside some time at the end here for audience questions. So Zoe, I want to start with you. When you look at this data as the president of the institute, but also in your role at NYU, how does this affect the work that you do?
So, I mean, as a college counseling service director, I think that our priority is to look for all the ways that we can provide the excellent quality care to our students. And so, of course, we were all ears listening to the data that Maeve and Dana just rolled out. I think there are, for me, 3 reasons that I think an institution should consider incorporating peer counseling. Above all else, for me, is that the existence of these peer counseling programs make the students who provide it feel a sense of fulfillment, as was discussed in the data, and that we must make room for our students in co-creating our interventions. This is not a generation of students that will wait for us to come up with the solutions. They want to be part of the solutions, and that, for me, is the primary reason that peer counseling programs are working. The second is that there is a set of students, as was discussed, that either racially marginalized students or LGBTQ students might choose a peer over a professional, either due to issues of stigma or because they feel that they can find better representation among their peers in receiving support from somebody who looks like them. And then finally, it could potentially increase capacity and minimize wait times for students looking for help from the professional counselors. All of these are positive reasons, but there are some concerns. And then, of course, we really want to focus on having these decisions about incorporating peer counseling be individual to the institutions who are considering them.
Yeah, I want to ask you about some of those concerns. The data shows that shows widespread but not universal training, right, for these students, and there's some gaps in knowledge specifically around emergency protocols. When you see that 16% figure, that 16% may not know what the emergency protocol is or whether there even is one, how concerning is that?
So that's concerning, and it really brings up the fact that these programs are sometimes affiliated with the counseling services, sometimes completely independent, sometimes informal, sometimes quite formalized within the institution. So really wrapping your arms around that as a college counseling service director or an administrator in student affairs is important because it's imperative that the students be uniformly trained. For two reasons. The first is that we want them to know what to do when they are encountering a higher risk situation. There will be a need to refer a student back to the licensed professionals at some point, and we want students to know what that threshold is. And the second is because we need the young people who are providing this peer counseling to be trained on how to take care of themselves as they are taking care of other people. The licensed professionals are taught this both in their academic work and their professional work every day. And so we want peer counselors to have some training around self-care because, of course, if you are helping another person, we want you to do so without burdening your own psychological stability.
But you suggested maybe formalizing the relationship between the counseling center and these student groups, these student-led groups. Wouldn't that, while that might fill the knowledge gap, would that undermine the mission, right? Because I was speaking with some students earlier this week, and they said one of the great things about peer counseling is that it removes the barrier of maybe feeling embarrassed to an adult, right? So as soon as it's formalized, does it undermine the power of the group?
Well, I mean, they don't have to be sort of staff members within the counseling service, but formalized in that they declare themselves so that they can be trained by the appropriate people, whether those people are affiliated with the institution or external experts. That I don't have a preference. I just want that the students that are providing this kind of care to their peers be uniformly trained. And in order for that to happen, they have to be known. Again, they don't have to be affiliated with the counseling service if an independence from them would actually help students consider them for care. But having the counseling service staff or, again, external staff provide uniform training to those students is really my priority.
Michael, Gerard, Mason, I want to bring you into the conversation here. As an advisor to one of these groups, a peer counseling group, created and targeted at Black students at UVA, what do you make of that specific finding that shows higher interest in peer counseling among Black students?
I mean, I have to admit, I wasn't necessarily surprised. I was actually excited about it. For so long, I think we've been tracking Black student experiences, particularly in predominantly white spaces, universities. But I've also discovered most recently that the trend is also true in HBCUs, that Black students do turn to one another for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about. One that I don't think we've necessarily named is the emotional cost of having to get over or work through what is perceived to be differences in experiences. And a lot of the students feel like when they're in crisis or they're really distressed, they don't have the emotional resources to have to educate somebody enough that they can be culturally attuned to the work that they need to get done. So I get that quite often, when students are starting to talk about rationales for, why they may choose to go to a student of color, particularly a Black student, if they're wanting to sort of talk with things that need to be culturally understood. So that's actually not that surprising to me. And I think it makes sense, especially when we start to think about frequency in which students experience complicated issues like feelings of, whether it's racism or discrimination or, different forms of isolation or exclusion, particularly around, the experiences of learning. So a lot of our students will describe having difficulty getting in study groups or having difficulty being around people with similar interests. So they sort of find themselves uh, being comforted uh, in similar situations rather than, cross-cultural in many ways, or a small percentage of them, not all of them, but definitely, that 4 out of 10 makes sense to me, 40% or so.
Yeah, and Black, transgender, first generation students are all more likely to say it's very important to find a peer counselor with someone with similar identities. Have
Yes.
you seen specific examples of that at UVA where a student might, not be forthcoming, but then once they are in front of someone who shares a similar background or looks like them, that they open up?
Absolutely. Man, that's a great question. So many examples. Uh, even recently, I learned of a student who had suspected that the person was drugged. That had never come out before, and it only came out in relation to a disclosure to another student. And I could probably go on and on and on about different situations where students are sort of self-disclosing. One of the things that I think is important to acknowledge, and it sort of connects us to the previous content, is that one of the major goals and the way that I do the Project Rise project here is there is a large chunk of the student experience that actually is developmental and probably is okay to be managed at the peer-to-peer domain. So not all things reach a clinical, diagnosis, or diagnosable, and they can be worked through with students. So a lot of that early homesickness, for instance, or a lot of the frustration with major choice, all of those things can be talked to, dealt with other students. What I think is really important, though, is that the peer counselors need to be trained on when they are now, in over their heads, or when they now need to refer to the professionals. And I think that's what has made the difference for a lot of us here at UVA, is the students are really confident in being able to recognize which things are developmental and which things are starting to have a clinical feel to them. And in this case, I am a clinician in our CAPS, and I am connected to that, largely student initiated and student run program. Um, so I definitely think we could go on and on and about that.
Right. Hannah, I want to bring in a student voice here. When you look at this data that shows interest in peer counseling has really spiked since the beginning of the pandemic, that makes sense, right? We've all been holed up, at home or with our families. What are you seeing and hearing on campus there in New York?
Right. I think that, like you said, it definitely makes sense. I think that within the last 2 years now, the level of uncertainty that has existed for students, and particularly like even in, thinking about the other health factors that contribute to mental health, oftentimes schools are primary sources of like shelter or homes or food. And I think the trauma of like being sent home, coming back, it not being safe to come back, has taken such a toll on students. And I also think that like are a lot of the mental health resources that are available, at least on my campus, are overwhelmed, as they always have been, but now it almost feels like they're getting to a point of bursting. And I think that that's why this research is so necessary, because I think it demonstrates how urgent investment into mental health resources for college students are, especially as uncertainty continues and so many folks are still reeling from and dealing with all of the traumas that come with the pandemic.
And you're not just a student and advocate, you're also a peer counselor yourself. How does this work at Columbia? Because I know it varies from campus to campus. How does the peer counseling work there?
Right. So I have peer counseled in high school, not at Columbia. I think that it differs from school to school. Columbia does benefit from, I think, being a private university that has all students included in our like tuition. We have a health and services fee that covers if we would like to go to the Counseling and Psychological Services Center. And so I think that from my understanding, I think that peer counseling actually comes maybe second to the number of students. I believe it's about 50% of students at Columbia actually go to see a therapist if it is available. And I think that that comes from the resources that Columbia has. However, peer counseling clubs and resources definitely exist by and large, but I think going to the conversation that we were having earlier, they're not necessarily sponsored by the university. It's much more so like a hotline type of thing that might be a one-off where students call in cases of emergencies.
Well, why do you think students are doing this work? I mean, the research suggests some things. It seems like there's, they benefit from this. There's a sense of mission. Why do you think students are likely to do this work?
Right. I mean, I think the point on the altruism didn't surprise me at all. I think students largely care about each other. We're all kind of in it together. And also as like a college student that has experienced college during the pandemic, I think we're uniquely bonded a little bit in the trauma that we've endured. And I also think, by and large, from the students that I've spoken to, a lot of us, I think, often feel like adults have failed us in many ways, right? In terms of prioritizing mental health in the same way that we prioritize physical health, in terms of like in a competitive academic atmosphere, being able to validate stress and mental illness and trauma. I think that honestly, the sense of community that comes from one student to another exists out of necessity, because I don't think it's something that you find many other places. And I also think that oftentimes as a college student, we're battling so many different factors that kind of tell us not to prioritize our mental health, right? Like you need to make the dean's list first. You might need to be working multiple jobs to support your family, to pay your tuition. And you need to find a job and this and that. I think that oftentimes the community comes out of, feeling like nobody else understands what's going on.
A lot of these programs that I've been looking at, in my reporting are technology based, right? They're driving students to apps or to confidential conversations online. As a student, what are the pros and cons of that?
Right. I think a pro of it is definitely accessibility, right? That not everybody is able to, go to something in person, especially nowadays, or being able to do it on your own time. I think the con of it is the sustainability, right? Like a lot of those apps might have a limit of how many times you're able to speak to someone. Also, I think that kind of what Michael was getting at earlier, I think the apps are kind of just the surface. What if you're encountering a more serious mental health issue? Is the app going to refer you to someone? It's not a person, I think that so often, especially in the pandemic and college in the pandemic, it's so isolating. I'm thinking of I've been fortunate to have roommates and friends because I had normal college before COVID hit. But a lot of the underclassmen I know who spent their first 2 years of college living in a room alone where they didn't know anybody on campus, I don't think an app is enough to counter that type of isolation and loneliness that must be occurring. And so I think that it scratches the surface. It's one of multiple supports that we would need to be able to truly support students.
I like that phrase. You had normal college as opposed to which is like bizarro college or whatever we want to call it. Amy Gatto, I want to bring you in. Amy's with Active Minds. Amy, you oversee a number of these campus-based mental health programs. What do you see as some of the benefits of peer counseling?
Yeah, great question, Kirk. So Active Minds is actually grounded in a chapter network, and we are across the country on college and high school campuses, and less formal peer counseling, a lot of peer support, peer-based work, and peer conversations. And what we've seen is similar to what the findings have found from this report and the anecdotal evidence that other panelists have stated. So in September 2020, so I think at that point we thought it was mid-pandemic, but who really knows when the midpoint was, so still early on. We actually surveyed students to have a better understanding of what they were experiencing during the pandemic, what they needed, and where they could go. And like anyone who's done any research during this time, we found that, students were struggling with their mental health. One promising finding that we did find was about 67% of students at that time had said they had supported someone else in their mental health. And so I think at Active Minds, what we really focus on is providing students with skills, not necessarily a formalized training program, but skills to recognize signs and symptoms of mental health concerns or conditions, to validate those, appreciate someone for sharing, and then make appropriate referrals. So, and this gets to what Michael was sharing earlier, and I think Zoe was touching on this a lot at the beginning. A lot of these training programs, there's just inconsistency. There's not a national or even a campus-based training program that peer counselors have to go through. At Active Minds, we really do focus on changing the conversation, and peers are the vehicle to which we do this. It's one of the strongest ways on college campuses for change to occur, especially inviting students into the conversation. But students also need to know, this is where they go if it is a clinical concern or if someone is in crisis. And then I think students who are the recipient of any sort of peer counseling also need to understand what that relationship looks like with their peer counselor. So when you're a student and you go to the counseling center, you can be provided certain protections. So you have HIPAA protections, there's FERPA, there's Title IX protections for you. Just understanding that as a peer counselor, or knowing that, this toes the line. I think Michael did a really great job of explaining, the developmental concerns versus the clinical ones. And so at Active Minds, we really focus on making sure our students in our chapter network and the greater higher ed and K through 12 community understand the value of recognizing these symptoms, understanding that everyone can be part of the solution, but you don't have to be a mental health specialist in order to be able to support someone who is struggling with their mental health.
The survey also finds that students are more likely to talk to their peers about stress, anxiety, and depression, and less likely to talk about suicide or self-harm. Here in New England, we've seen some campuses really struggling with this, where they're coping with the spate of suicides. Do you see peer counseling as part of the solution for a campus that's grappling with that, or is that the case where this needs to be, those students need to reach out to professionals?
So I think that there's a mixture here. So when we think about prevention, we can think about universal prevention. And if you look at the American College Health Association data and even some of the Healthy Minds data, we know that a lot of the top impediments to student success are around mental health indicators. But some of them are anxiety, loneliness, homesickness. They don't always have clinical indicators. So there is a really strong opportunity for campuses to utilize peers in some of these concerns. But there also is a need on campuses to support student mental health when it does get to those clinical levels. So when we think about the prevention models, having this, universal prevention where we're reaching everyone on campus, making these changes, but then also treatment. That's key, because a universal prevention program isn't going to have the same effect for a student who is suffering from suicidal ideation as it would. So, and I would love to turn it over to my colleagues too, who are seeing more students, to see if they have anything to chime in on that.
Yeah, Zoe, what do you think? Because I was talking to some student advocates, mental health advocates at a local campus here, and they're really enthusiastic about the peer counseling that they're doing. They want to get their organization on the back of the student ID cards, just like you have the hotline number at NYU. Is that the right spot, or do you think that then the messaging gets a little conflated?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no accounting for who a student will present a high risk issue to, right? And that is again a commentary on all of us needing training. That is the faculty, the students, the peer counselors, the administrators, the people who serve the food, the public safety officers, because we don't actually know who a student will feel comfortable talking to. But that also means, and to my colleague who also said this earlier, that students, peer counselors, resident assistants, any student leader on a campus has to know the line for when the issue actually has now turned into a clinical one and needs to be referred back to the counseling service. And that is part of this uniform training that we've been discussing. And so then, peer counseling becomes another door to be opened as an option for students to talk about their mental health issues, taking into account how they feel about representation, taking into account how they feel about stigma, taking into account how they feel about perhaps a young person better understanding them than someone who is older. So, but the counseling services need to be thinking about that. If that's true, and this is another open door, the existence of a peer counseling program will actually increase utilization within the counseling service for those higher risk students. And that's important and necessary and should be the goal. But then they have to be looking at their capacity issues from that perspective as well.
Michael, if these peer counseling groups are a door, Zoe described them, should administrators be pointing students in that direction, or should they just let the students find that door, in their own time? You are muted, my friend. Oh, uh-oh, we got a technical issue. Let me see.
So, all right. So I am actually a proponent of directing students to peer counseling. I absolutely believe in it. I absolutely trust the students to do really good work within the domain which they're trained to do. And then I also am very keen to trust them to refer when they can't or when they're out of their league. So in many ways, I think this only works if universities wholly build out systems that they can trust and rely on. As long as we leave it as this sort of amorphous sort of thing, nobody's going to be comfortable, because the reality of this moment is acuity is escalating, right? The amount of students who are presenting with very complex psychological needs is actually, it's extraordinary right now. So the likelihood of a peer counselor encountering something that's probably out of their league right now is very high. So I can understand the anxiety. One thing that we haven't mentioned that I think is worth noting is even pre-pandemic, and I'm at UVA, so we're sort of at the epicenter of a lot of shenanigans, right? Don't be smiling, Hannah. I see that.
Like what?
We've had a lot of things happen at UVA which have actually set the national bar for ways that we respond to things. And even if it's not us at UVA, it's our state, Virginia. So we've sort of had some things that have guided the conversation. So right now, for instance, simple things like recent developments in Title IX, where faculty, staff, employees, all of the CSAs are now responsible to trigger events when they discover from a student that something has happened within the Title IX domain. Or even now at UVA, which is not necessarily national yet, but because of things that happen in our state, faculty are even encouraged when they learn that a student is suicidal. They necessarily have to reach out to the counseling center. So in those sort of complex situations, students have to be educated that these are the implications of disclosing things to people who are responsible employees at the university, which in many ways encourages the students to sort of keep that in the peer domain if they're trying to have some agency about how the university responds. So we haven't necessarily named that, but that's at play too, that the students are now trying to figure out, this bad thing happened to me, and I don't know that I necessarily want to trigger, for instance, a full Title IX investigation. So that necessarily has to stay within the peer domain if I want to keep it from the university, right? So that's at play. So I think the peer domain is actually absorbing a lot of things, which in some ways may be chilled by the larger emphasis to try to, protect our communities. And that's something to be debating too.
A lot of experts have said we can't hire our way out of this problem, right? At UVA, since your group started there, the peer counseling group, have you noticed a reduction in demand? You're laughing. No,
I'm laughing because this is right where Zoe was. Absolutely not. No, it's doing exactly what it's intended to do, which is reduce stigma. So when I started this project, I think in 2010, utilization for Black students alone at the counseling center was around 5-6%. We're almost at 20 now. That's what happens. The moment, you start to decrease stigma, the moment you start to normalize all of these things, you're going to get higher utilization. So you're right. We'll never hire our way out of this. And I think I want to go back to an earlier question about this work and the implications for counseling centers, because that's sort of what we're talking about.
Right.
And I think it's really a complicated dynamic when you have expressed, data and interest in having people who have a shared experience. And then you go to the counseling center and there may be one or two, particularly Black clinicians, and even, some less percent of people of color. That struggle, it creates struggles for utilization when people are really just saying, hey, I just want to talk to somebody who at least on the surface of it looks like me, at least on the surface of it has some shared understanding of my difficulties. And I think the pandemic has definitely exacerbated, and the people who are in positions of hiring will know, it's a difficult market right now. And I think, we can do any number of searches, and that's no guarantee that you'll get the kind of quality, clinician. And definitely, when you start to talk about diversity characteristics, that's even more difficult. It's just really tough to hire now.
Are you finding burnout there? Because I was talking to a director of a counseling center here in Boston yesterday, and I asked him how big his staff was, and it took him about 5 minutes to figure out who's still with them. And there's, some people had left because of burnout. Other people, are you finding that with this increased demand that your staff is overburdened? And also, what does that mean for students too? I remember what it was like to be a student. I imagine if I was a peer counselor and I was getting pinged on my phone, that would be highly distracting and also probably emotionally overwhelming.
Well, I will say yes. There's burnout, but there's also all sorts of other things. People are starting to reassess life generally. So somebody may say, what, I've been, for even in my own experience, I've been doing, crisis management for 20 years. Maybe I can do something else, which is not crisis management. Not necessarily because I'm burnt out, but I'm at a point now where I might just reassess. Is this what I want to do with my skills, my knowledge, my interests, my mission work? Maybe this is no longer the domain. This is not what I signed up for 20 years ago, right? And I think a lot of people are just sort of now, given the pandemic, reevaluating their lives and making informed decisions, not because of burnout, just because, professionals who are really thoughtful make good decisions for themselves. And sometimes that means leaving the counseling center.
And you can only cook so much sourdough bread. Hana, you had unmuted yourself. Do you want to jump in?
Right, definitely. I was also smiling because I'm actually originally from DC, so I understand the role Virginia is playing right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to add, Michael, what you were saying about the mandated reporting. For instance, I was an orientation leader for freshmen who were moving in at the beginning of the year this year, and I was a mandated reporter for 2.5 weeks. of the first 2.5 weeks of school. And then after that, I was not. And you say when you're an orientation leader, you obviously have to disclose if you're a mandated reporter, but that timeline switch is also really interesting because it's like, if you need to tell me something right now, I will be mandated to report. If you tell me a week from now, I will not. And that alters the conversations that are happening because of what you were saying of, do students want to trigger this whole line of, reporters? And I think that's also evident in the data that we're seeing from this report, right? Where it's like why students might be turning to a friend or a peer in more informal conversations. And I think to add to the point on, I know we can't hire our way out of it, but I will say, I think we can compensate young people out of it a little bit. I think the question of whether peer counselors should be compensated is a really important one. And I think particularly when we're looking at LGBTQ students, Black students who are looking for people that look like them in their counseling, right? The way to hire more counselors is to make it more accessible and to be compensating, in my opinion, the folks that are already marginalized, who are already probably more in need of the compensation because of how generations of oppression work. Like, I think that that's a point that can't be overlooked. Too often universities rely on free labor from students. And as a student at the university that just had the biggest strike in the country, I'll say that I would just want to emphasize that point because, it's one thing to talk about the emotional toll of peer counseling on the peer counselors, but it's also another to talk about the very real economic and financial toll, right? When those hours can be spent making money in other ways, like that's also an incentive not to be a counselor.
Amy, what do you think of that idea? Do you think these schools should be paying these counselors? Because that does, that changes the relationship, right? We've seen this debated in athletics. Does it change the mental health relationship?
I think it goes back to how's the program structured on that campus, right? On college campuses, it is not atypical to have students work for free, but it's also not atypical to have students who are compensated, right? We think about federal work study students, student employees on campuses. Institutions are powered by student workers. And I'm always a proponent of we should compensate people for their work, including students. That being said, though, when it comes to this peer counseling, one way that I like to think about it is we know that the pipeline to mental health careers doesn't always give us those who represent minoritized identities. And I see offering peer counselors, especially seeing this need and this interest for students on campuses who do have minoritized identities, gravitating towards those who maybe aren't finding it in their counseling center. I think it being incredibly valuable, not only for campuses, but for the field of mental health in having greater representation and starting to integrate more unique voices in the conversation sooner, starting to elevate these students as resources, providing them with training and teaching them, what is within their scope and what needs to be elevated, but also encouraging them to pursue graduate programs, to pursue professional behavioral health occupations, to continue to grow to support people's mental health.
Zoe, Michael, just quickly, yay or nay? Should we pay these peer counselors or not?
I mean, I think as a human being, I think people, no matter who they are, should be compensated for the work they do. As I think about it, if that can result, if payment can result in the formalizing of these programs in so much as they all then agree to a certain level of training, then I think that there's even more argument to pay them. Because again, my priority, and again, it doesn't matter to me whether they're formalized within the counseling service or independent, but it's really important that training take place. And so if there is funding attached and that can be sort of a requirement, that would be important to me from my perspective. And
Michael, what do you think?
I have mixed feelings, not because I don't understand the inequity in all of this. The first thing I'll say is I think the moment we start paying people, legally they start to have the same burdens that staff have. And I think that becomes counterindicated for what reasons students are using the peer support. So that's where I think all of this gets tricky. That said, one of the things that I did was I institutionalized the training that the students were getting at UVA. So I actually designed a 2-course curriculum so that all of the students who were actually wanting to become peer counselors could take 2 courses, which is 6 credits in the School of Education. And that's really significant, especially, if I'm committed to them being academically successful, then that even has an added benefit, right? Where students are going to get a great course. They're going to meet like-minded students who are engaged and empathic, and they were going to build a network of people who are, encouraged and who love doing the humanistic work. That's great. And for a lot of our students, that's turned out to be a significant benefit. And before I knew it, the course ended up, the 2 courses became a part of the health and well-being minor. They sort of meet some of the requirements for some of the majors. So that's reward enough. So, I'm sort of dancing around, how do I give something substantive for the investment without necessarily creating these externalities about reporting? Because I think it gets really complicated. But I love the idea of pay.
Have your students involved in Project Rise ever asked for compensation?
That's how it became a course, because they
You pay them with tuition.
Yes, they were trying to figure out, what are we doing, man? You know,
Right.
we show up.
It doesn't have to be money. You can
Yes,
pay them
yes.
with education.
But I pay them with the credits, and that actually is just as useful, really.
It's probably worth more at this point. This is great. Just a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them into the chat. We have a question here for Zoe or Dr. Mason. How important and feasible is increasing access to peer counseling after hours, like Saturday to Sunday and after 5 p.m. midweek? So again, how important and feasible is increasing access to peer counseling after hours?
Well, if we consider that, students are available at varying times, and if we're looking at peer counseling as a way to expand the reach of the licensed professional counseling on campus, then it would be very important to be able to offer availability after hours and on weekends. And again, it's back to, what are the resources that peer counselor has if they encounter at 10 o'clock in the morning or at 10 o'clock at night a student who needs sort of a licensed professional intervention in that moment. The university has to establish systems, and those peer counselors need to be trained so that they know what to do regardless of the time.
Michael, same question to you.
I guess the first thought I'll say is that I have so many thoughts about this stuff. The first thing that I said is, I think we have to be very careful about balancing the amount of responsibility students have for other students. So I like to keep things quite boundaried. So for instance, with my students, I would say, you want to be careful, because weekends are useful for students to do all sorts of things, right? So the moment we start spilling over into that space, we're actually doing more harm than good. I think that's the first thing. So I would always encourage my students to say, if something is happening and, people need weekend or after hours support, here's the crisis number, here's the call, here are the things that you can do, which are sort of institutionalized, and then we can sort of pick that up. That said, the reason that I also created this course and began to offer it across our entire university is because I figured out one thing, and it's that I would not actually begin to shift the experience of students of color if I were only targeting training to students of color. That's the first part.
What do you mean by that?
That's a great question. So if I'm teaching Black students how to recognize, when they've been hurt or when they feel like they're suffering, and how to be helpful to each other, that's one component. But one of the things that we've learned now over the last 15 years, that the vast majority, just like we're looking at right now, helpfulness is happening in the peer domain. Also, the amount of hurt and suffering that's caused at a university is also in the peer domain. So one of the things that I've started to do is give the university-wide students, the capacity to recognize when they are hurting and when they are helping. So all students take my classes, not just Black students, not just brown, or BIPOC students. Everybody should benefit from this training, and that ultimately will reduce the level of infraction, the level of hurt that's happening in your community. So I think that's important, and the reason I'm talking about that is because I've understood that this peer-to-peer stuff, regardless of how much we try to regulate it, is actually happening organically. So the peers are doing this on the buses, they're doing it outside at the parties, they're doing it in the library, in the dormitories, in the cafeteria. It's happening everywhere. So I think we also just have to bear that in mind, that when we're training people, or we're just giving people tools to be helpful, they're not just using them in structured ways. So on the one hand, I do try to encourage students to use institutionalized things so that they have the opportunities to take care of themselves. At the same time, I'm also aware that in reality, these things are going to be happening at all times. So you have to find the balance.
If you read the newspaper or listen to public media all day, public radio all day, it would be easy to get pessimistic about the future of mental health resources on campus. What, Amy, when you look across all your campuses and all your chapters, and this is a question for all of you, we can kind of go around the horn here, but start with Amy. What brings you hope about the future of mental health resources on campus?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that brings me hope about the future of mental health resources, there's two things. One is just the way that students are involved, the way they continue to be involved, and ways that they are really elevating and amplifying their voices. So we're seeing students from the grassroots level start to make change on campus, whether it's with each other through programs like peer counseling and our chapter network. But also they're starting to change institution policy and advocating for more counselors in the counseling center, or integrating mental health in the strategic plan. The other one is I think the pandemic has really highlighted a lapse in mental health resources and a need for them in a wide array of places. If you look at data now, university presidents are saying that mental health concerns are one of the top concerns on college campuses. And so we've been seeing an increase in prevalence. The pandemic has really just highlighted the need for supports, and we're being really innovative and intentional in starting to create resources that benefit students, faculty, staff, and campuses overall.
That's great. Zoe, why are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful for many reasons, including the fact that I don't think there's any university leadership. And when I say leadership, I mean senior leadership, the president, the provost. I don't think there's any university in this moment, perhaps a silver lining from the pandemic, that is not talking about the well-being of its students in a way that I did not see before the pandemic. So that makes me hopeful as it relates to resources, and also as it relates just to the perspective that physical health and mental health really do go hand in hand and should be prioritized equally.
Dr.
Michael Mason?
Yeah. In addition to the things that, my colleagues have said, I think history gives me hope. And I lean pretty heavily into the reality that, as humans, as a people, we've been able to be quite resilient and come through quite, lots of different scenarios where things look really bad. And I think in this moment, we're all developing a language to sort of articulate our human experiences. I think we're all struggling to try to become more empathic every day and think about both the difficulties people experience and sometimes the roles we play in that. So those things give me hope that, one, I'm certain we're going to come through on the other side and be stronger and better. At the same time, there are more people who are stakeholders in becoming better. So that gives me a lot of hope. And students are brilliant, and students are, that's the good news, that there are students who are inherently more hopeful and excited than some of us are.
Right. Students like Hana. Hana, why? I guess I shouldn't lead the witness. Are you hopeful? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I'm definitely very hopeful. I think that even in my lifetime thus far, I've seen stigma fall. I think that from my freshman year of high school to now my senior year of college, I hear people talk about their mental health and their mental wellness openly and freely. I definitely agree. Since the pandemic, I've heard professors start off our classes before they go over the syllabus, telling us that they want us to prioritize our wellness. Even conversations with my parents and people of generations before me, I've never heard conversations about mental health and wellness go so freely and openly. And I think that knowing that's happening now makes me more hopeful, because it feels like we can all be a little more human.
That was great. We have a specific question for either Dr. Mason or Zoe. What are the options for students who seek peer counseling? Is it just a one-time meeting, or can these students have the option to meet with the same peer counselor repeatedly?
I mean, that really depends on the institution and how the program is structured there. I've heard of many programs where the student can see a person one time, but I've also heard of a few where it's just like with, the short-term counseling that's available within the counseling services, where the student can see the same person more than once. So it really depends, and Dr. Mason can talk about how it's structured there.
Yeah, how does it work with Project Rise?
So here they can definitely see the same person. We're the only restriction is that I think in our model we try to limit the number of times that they can have the structured appointments, not necessarily because the resources are limited. We also aware that people can begin to develop dependencies. So we try to build in layers of support rather than just say we're going to create a scenario where one student needs to meet with one student for a whole year, for instance. If that's the case, then we probably should be layering in different things. So groups and social groups and, clinical encounters in the counseling center. So that's the only restriction, really. And I think that mirrors, if we're, again, looking at the organic situation, the students are going to keep going to the same people, right? That's natural. They're going to always go to the people they want to go to. So I think we have to be mindful of that. But in Project Rise, they can come back to the same student.
Yeah, I was talking to some students at Boston College where they use it's a confidential chat, and this is foreign to me because when I was in college, Facebook was like in its infancy, and we were on AOL Instant Messenger. These students are actually sending text out there, and then the counselors are kind of deciding who's going to field that one, and then the conversation goes on for a bit, but they're kind of self-assigning the counseling. Is that a good approach?
You're talking about with the peers?
Yeah, with the
There's
peers.
sort of
But basically, they're receiving these confidential messages, and then the counselors, I think there's 15 or 20 of them, they talk among themselves and say, who wants this one?
Yeah. I mean, really, it depends on the supervision, right? I mean, these students will have had to be trained on how to decide for themselves, or according to whichever protocols, which ones are appropriate for them and which ones should be referred, or, how you can be the conduit to referring. You never want one of these text messages to go unanswered. They always have to be reviewed, and then back to the question about the time, are there enough people? I mean, there's just so many considerations. So I don't want to say it's a good or bad idea. It sounds like one of great access. So that's great that a student could sort of put their issue out there and expect a response, but the structures have to be in place to make sure that happens in every case.
Right. Go unanswered or go public, right? I mean, once these texts are out there, they could go out. And we have a question here. Maybe Amy, you could take this one. How have these peer counseling programs been received on small campuses where everyone knows everyone, right? Where you put yourself out there, there's a good chance that half your dorm is going to know about your mental health issues.
I think this goes to, what we've been talking about is the structure of the peer counseling or peer support programs and what it looks like on campus, what privacy considerations are taking place, where these groups meet, how many students are there, what's protected information, when are things being elevated, right? So this is where I think what's nice about peer counseling and peer support programs is they can be tailored for each campus to meet the needs that are unique to that campus. So from us, you haven't heard of a one-size-fits-all approach because that wouldn't work in this case. And so it would really be assessing, okay, if we're going to do this on our campus, what does the structure look like? How are students involved? How's professional staff involved? What does the referral process look like? How are we supporting those students to ensure things like what the question says? How do you make sure no one knows that you're talking to a student about this, or how's your privacy protected?
That was great. And is this something that you hear students worry about? I mean, it seems like your generation, a lot of people have written about this. You're much more willing to talk about these issues than previous generations. Are students worried about privacy?
I think it's definitely a concern, like everyone has said, but I do think that there's a level of trust, because I think most folks know that those who are volunteering or are working at these peer counseling sites are doing so out of a sense of altruism. So there's a sense of respect for one's confidentiality and concerns. I think that it's always in the back of your head, but you do tend to think that the folks that are being kind enough to listen to you are also, trained to know the seriousness of, breaching your privacy.
This is a good forward-looking question. One of our viewers is curious to learn about certain recommendations for peer counseling training programs. If I'm an administrator on a college campus trying to help students learn emergency protocols and how they can best serve themselves, are there certain training programs out there that you would recommend?
I can give a book, and again, I'll give you this book because it's the book I started with, many years ago. But if you look up an author, her name is Judith A. Tyndall. She wrote a couple of books. Peer Power is the title of it. And it really walks you through the complete setup, evaluation, and tracking of a peer counseling program. For anybody who's really interested in sort of getting your mind wrapped around what this stuff can look like, I think that was the gold standard for the models, some years ago. She's revised it a few times. I would start with that because it gives you both the administrative piece of it, the theory that's needed to understand what those things are. But the second component is a workbook, which walks you through all of the training modules that are really useful for the peers. So I would start with her. Her work was actually instrumental to me as I began to design Project Rise years ago.
I think to jump in for campuses who are looking for kind of like, what can I do now, or where can I start here? One thing that I really like about the report that was just released is towards the end, there are some resources. I believe our colleagues at Mental Health America do have some peer support trainings. And then there are campuses who have these programs. So University of Michigan has the Wolverine Support Network. We've heard from Michael about his peer support network. So I think it might be looking either at peer institutions or model institutions, looking at peer counseling, but also maybe health and wellness coaching programs, which have a fair amount of overlap, and kind of examining them for best practices. And then if it's students who are really interested in this, there is the Active Minds Chapter Network, which isn't as focused on peer counseling, but it is that peer-to-peer support and working to change conversation about mental health on campus. And a lot of our students do find value in going to these meetings, connecting with others who are like-minded, and helping people on campus start to identify any sort of mental health issues and refer them to appropriate support.
Zoe, do you have certain recommendations?
I don't have specific ones, although I do agree with everything my colleagues have said. I mean, but in my mind, I can sort of, imagine the headings, right? You need to be able to provide, emergency response. You need to be able to provide training on empathic listening and, how to listen to another person. You need a section on taking care of yourself while you take care of other people. You need a section on, what is mental health, right? I mean, similarly to the way we train the resident assistants or other student leaders, you need to be teaching people when somebody says anxiety or when somebody says depression or when somebody says stress, what is that exactly and how should I be interpreting that? I mean, so, I'm imagining the headings in my head, which I'm sure are contained in the resources that my colleagues have provided.
Hannah, you said you were a peer counselor in high school, right? In growing up near DC or in DC? What was your training like?
Yeah, our training was based on a curriculum called Sources of Strength, and it was essentially to train us in identifying what the different components of wellness looked like. And that was like the emphasis of the training. It also did feature, identifying, when things might lead to a crisis, what we've been talking about, when it's beyond my control or abilities to support my peer. And I think that it was definitely very useful in terms of like the day-to-day conversations that you would have. But I will say that, like, I think that like my colleagues have emphasized, I think the knowing when it's your line, especially when we have this conversation of mandated reporters, when is it not enough? When can I not support my peer enough? Was the thing that was lacking a little bit, because I think that the curriculum did more to emphasize the sources of strength we could find in one another, but not what we couldn't find in one another, if that makes sense.
But Michael and Zoe, when you were if you can remember back to when you were in college, was there an equivalent of this, of peer counseling, or was it kind of you found like-minded people who supported your mental health through clubs and volunteer work, or and do you think that that's changed? Because I remember the mental health counseling center when I was at school was kind of like introduced on orientation day, and then you kind of walked by it in the campus center, and it seems like that's very much changed in a short period of time. But I found, if I was stressed, I was able to blow off steam by getting involved in something. Were there peer counseling networks for you when you were in college?
Well, first of all, you're asking me to think back a long time ago. And I think,
I didn't put a time frame on it.
Yeah, things were a lot more stigmatized then. I think that I'm pretty sure there was not a formalized program, but I think, as we've been discussing, these things have always taken place, right? Students have always been supporting each other informally, and perhaps not as responsibly as they should have. I mean, I know I took on friends with significant mental health issues, and I'm not so sure I did that in the most responsible way. So I think there is something to be said for knocking down the stigma as much as possible, to the point where people feel comfortable talking about their mental health issues, and those who are training them know that these programs exist, and that we should make sure that our peers have uniform training to do this work well.
And Dr. Mason, what did peer counseling look like in your college days? Is he frozen? Amy, how about you? Do you want to jump in? I think we're having some technical issues with Dr. Mason.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think when I think back to it, a lot of it was peer education. And I do think that there's a lot of space in this conversation too, to think about how peer education groups can support student mental health. I think in those days, the conversation wasn't as centered around mental health as it is right now, but really having peer education groups, being able to provide resources, a lot of mindfulness events or self-care events on campus, those sort of things. So more of that universal level prevention. But I didn't have experience with peer counselors, but I agree with Zoe. There was probably a lot of informal counseling and conversations, and then so much with what you were saying, Kirk, about levels of belonging and students really connecting with other students based on their area of interest. I think peer counseling I don't even want to say it's formal, because it doesn't have to be on campus, but it's a more clear path in supporting student mental health.
Right. And it seems like this generation in many ways is more mindful of not just mental health, but also their physical health. And I remember we did a story a number of years ago about there's a dorm at UVM that's like the wellness center, and everyone who lives there pledges to, live a very healthy lifestyle. And that's just, for me, that was so foreign to my college experience, where a lot of the things that we did to blow off steam probably were detrimental to our mental health or to our physical health. So it seems like that's another important thing, and that dorm is institutionalized. But it seems like this is something that is certainly taking off. I hope Dr. Mason can rejoin us. We're nearing the end here. If you have any final questions, please throw them into the chat. There's Dr. Mason. Great, you're back. You tried to dodge my college years question.
Yes, I was celebrating as I was panicking. I was like, oh, geez, okay. It's all right.
Oops, technical difficulty.
Yeah, well, while the questions are coming in, I was laughing because my wife and I, we sort of chat every so often, where we just sort of ask ourselves, were we unhappy as college students? It's been so long ago, everything is rolled over at this point, and then she says, wait a minute, no, we weren't. And, do you remember so-and-so? They weren't happy either. Or do you remember that this happened? And I was like, oh, right. Those things fit in the Title IX category. Oh, those things fit in the TAT sort of situation. Oh, those things, now we have this language that I don't think I had as an undergrad to describe some really complicated things we were having. But to answer the question more directly, I don't think we had peer counseling projects. That wasn't the nature of it. We had sort of communal resources, but not in the formal way that we're describing it.
This was so helpful, and I really appreciate you all taking the time and sharing your expertise and your experiences. I hope this is helpful to everyone tuning in at home or from their own college campus. I would like to thank the Born This Way Foundation and the Mary Christie Institute for funding and conducting this research. As a reporter, it's so helpful to have these nuggets that we can inform our reporting and inform our audience with. So thank you all so much. Hope to see you soon in person. It's always great working with you all. Take care.